Good evening. My name is Macy Waddle, and I am a sophomore McConnell Scholar. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Aurelian Craiutu. Dr. Craiutu is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He has published and edited several books on French political thought, included but not limited to Tocqueville on America after 1840, A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought, 1748 through 1830, and his new book, Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Craiutu.
Thank you, Macy, for the correct pronunciation of my last name, which is a Romanian name, if you're wondering. Thanks, Greg, for the kind invitation to the center and to everyone who made this visit possible. I wanted to talk to you tonight about a virtue that is not very appealing today. It actually may seem pointless to speak about moderation as we enter yet another electoral year. The temperature of the political game is again very high, and I don't need to tell you about that. The stakes seem higher than ever. So let's start with a simple question as we think about this. Who needs moderation today? When asking this question, I'm reminded of Barry Goldwater, who once said in 1964 a few things about moderation that are listed on the handout that I circulated, and I think that it is the second quote on the handout. Actually, it's the first one, excuse me. He said, extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I'm sure most of you may be inclined, at least at first try, to think about the present moment that doesn't need moderation any more than the 1960s when Goldwater uttered these words. We all live today in bubbles and echo chambers, and we see around us people who enjoy living in those bubbles. Practicing moderation, if you consider a political career, seems to be a self-defeating course of action. So is this really the case? And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I think my answer that I will try to sketch with you is a decisive no. It's not a self-defeating course of action. I want to demonstrate today, by looking at a number of topics that are listed on my handout, that moderation constitutes an entire archipelago and tradition of thought that is worth considering in its own terms, and that we need to challenge the conventional image of moderation as a weak and ineffective virtue appropriate only to losers. If you want to be a loser, you practice moderation. That's the image that I want to challenge. This is a lesson that I follow from Edmund Burke, who warned us 2 centuries ago that moderation is a difficult virtue, that it's number 2 on the handout, has been stigmatized as the true virtue of cowards and compromise as the prudence of traitors. The quote from Burke is longer than the one that I'm going to read, so you are welcome to look at it. But I think it's important to also look at what John Adams said about moderation. He admitted that without moderation, this is number 4 on the list, without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. So if this is so, if this is true, if Burke and Adams were right, why is it the case then that moderates have become a sort of endangered species in our politics today? And is there anything we can do to save this extinct species from disappearing today? So I want to move on to talk a little bit about the current skepticism about moderation, which some of you may share. So it is no secret that moderation has a bad rap in today's world. We live in a world of fake news and alternative facts, and moderates do not seem to have the upper hand. Many of those who are running for office in this climate, dominated by hyperbole and ideological intransigence, are keen to distinguish themselves from those who might want to work across party lines and strike timely compromises with those who are of a different political orientation. Moderates, moreover, have been the victims of gerrymandering and public insults in public media, and they've been challenged consistently in primaries by opponents who campaigned by stressing political purity and litmus tests, my way or the highway. So no wonder that, given this image, moderation carries the connotation of weakness and indecisiveness. According to this view, which I challenge in today's talk, moderation is practiced only by weak individuals unable to hold firm opinions and unable to make strong decisions. Others, also critical of moderation, equate this virtue with opportunism or see it as a synonym of mediocrity and pettiness. According to the second view, equally unfavorable to moderation, moderates lack moral principles, endorse dubious compromises, and they may end up defending an unsavory center between the extremes that is devoid of substance. And this is certainly the view of Rush Limbaugh. It's number 5 on the handout here, who said basically that great moderates in American history have never existed. Brave moderates is an oxymoron, and as a result we should give up on practicing moderation. Yet there is another view that moderation can never be truly democratic or radical enough because it lacks a clear moral or political compass. And this is usually a critique leveled from the left. According to this claim, moderation amounts in practice to endorsing the status quo, so the current hierarchy, and condones various forms of injustice. And this view of moderation can be found in the letters from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr., who was also critical of a certain type of moderation, the moderation of the white man, he said, who ends up affirming the status quo, the injustice of the status quo. So all of these are serious criticism that I want to take very seriously and consider with you tonight. They remind us, if anything, that it's very difficult to be enthusiastic about a virtue which seems to lack charisma. And if you look at the third quote from my handout, it comes from Alexis de Tocqueville, who is the patron saint figure of this center for this semester, I understand. And Tocqueville himself understood very clearly that in times when passion seems to gain control over human affairs, it's dreamers, utopians who gather attention and gain attention, not the moderates. Okay. And yet I believe that most of these critiques are based on a distortion, on a partial or a full misunderstanding of moderation, which is a complex virtue with many facets. So how so, you might ask? First, I think that it's important to point out that we're having here an old concept with deep roots in classical and modern political thought and various religious traditions. You can find moderation embedded in Christianity, in Judaism, in the Muslim world, and in Confucianism, to name only 4 major religions. Enlightened minds from the past saw something in moderation that we seem to be unable to see today. I'll give a few examples here. If you read Roman history, you probably came across the name of Tacitus. Tacitus called moderation the most difficult lesson of wisdom. Okay? Montesquieu, in the 18th century, praised it as the supreme virtue of the legislator in the spirit of the laws. The word moderation appears many times in the Federalist Papers themselves. They refer 11 times to the oracle called Montesquieu, who praised moderation, but there are other instances where the word appears. It also appears in Washington's famous farewell address from 1796. Our first president regarding moderation, if you recall, as a pillar of the republic and a sign of power rather than weakness. Tocqueville himself, again, believed that moderation was the key invisible idea at the core of his masterpiece, Democracy in America. He said that in a note, that that's the core idea at the heart of democracy in America. So what all of these authors remind us is that moderation is much more than a simple trait of character. We seem to associate moderation with X or Y is a moderate person. What does it mean? It means that it's not extreme. But there's much more than that. In addition to the ethical meaning, it also has a distinctively institutional/constitutionalist component, and it's also a style of political action that I want to talk about. Okay? The ethical side of moderation is easier to understand, and it's the one that we instinctively associate moderation with. Take, for example, the concept of the golden mean. It's the golden mean between the extreme, too much, too little. That goes back to the ancients again, but it has lots of reverberations in modern literature. The institutional constitutional component is less well known. It's illustrated in the concept of moderate government in the writings of Montesquieu and the Federalist Papers. If you think about what the Federalist Papers argue for, that is a concept of moderate government. Those are the governments that seek to place power in different hands, in different quarters, so that they prevent power from being abused. Okay? So they seek to achieve a balance between different set of interests and groups in society, a balance that can offer an effective way of governing diverse and plural societies. That's the second aspect of moderation, the constitutional/institutional. The third facet of moderation has to do with the spirit and the style of moderation. Now, those are not easy to define, I grant you. It is the spirit, if you ask me what would be the spirit of moderation, it is the spirit that resembles in many ways the spirit of liberty defined by Judge Learned Hand in a famous passage. It's a spirit, the spirit of moderation this time, that is not sure that it is always right, and it is open to learning from others and confronting one's ideas to those of others. When it comes to defining the style of moderation, I can think of such virtues as humility, modesty, prudence, and civility, all of which I wrote about in the third or fourth part of my book, Why Not Moderation. They belong to what I call the semantic field of moderation. Moderation cannot be understood apart from those other virtues: civility, prudence, modesty, humility. So as such, moderation, as I understand it, is a difficult virtue that presupposes several things. What does it presuppose? Let's go over a short list here. It presupposes first the courage to swim against the current. Okay? In many respects, I think that moderates are similar to the brave tightrope walkers, okay, who must always be extremely careful to maintain their balance to avoid falling down. If you have a thin tightrope and you want to walk on it between two towers, you are always going to need a lot of courage, a lot of skill, and a lot of determination, and a good deal of luck to stay up there. Moderation is also a difficult virtue because it defies universal claims and moral absolutes. It's easy to say you need to be just in all circumstances, but to be moderate, it requires to learn how to read circumstances. When it's time to lean a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. So you make judicious choices. But they are not to be governed by moral absolutes. Moderation also demands intuition and discernment, what we call in political science political judgment. If you look for people teaching courses on political judgment, you will find very few in between, because political judgment is something like an art. Okay? It lacks a precise algorithm which could be applied indiscriminately to all situations. Okay? Moderation also requires the knowledge of when not to be a moderate. Okay? In other words, it's not a virtue for everyone and for all seasons. There are moments when it's okay, it's actually necessary, it's mandatory to be immoderate for a little while. Okay? So what is moderate in one context, let's say 1950s, may not be moderate today in 2020s or so. So there are periods in history when you don't have to be moderate, or moments. So far from being a soft-minded, timid, and hesitant virtue for people who lack courage, moderation is appropriate to people who actually are very courageous, who refuse the ideological purity tests and the litmus tests, and those who oppose zealotry and fanaticism in all forms. Okay? Moderation, as I understand it, promotes openness and generosity towards others, even those with whom you disagree. and refuses to practice political vendettas against your political opponents. You don't try to crush your opponents. You need them. You need them for your purposes, but you also need because they know something that you may not know. So the fourth point on my agenda here has to do with what do moderates stand for? And that's a difficult part of my talk because there are many faces of moderation here, and there's no single thing that I can pinpoint that could convince you that moderates defend one thing. What I would like to talk instead is, first, what is the mentality of those who embrace moderation, who put moderation first? I would say that moderates share a steady preoccupation with avoiding and fighting political evil in all of its forms. And they seek to avoid the extremes of cruelty, anarchy, and civil war. Those are red lines for moderates. Okay? They tend to keep the lines of dialogue open, even, or perhaps most importantly, with their political opponents, in order to preserve the fundamental values of their communities. And to do so, they reject an all-or-nothing approach and always keep an open mind, accepting new evidence and considering arguments from all sides, including from their opponents. Moderates, in other words, do not see the world in Manichaean terms. Manichaeanism here is a way of showing, of looking at the world in stark contrast, black and white. Okay? That's exactly what moderates do not do. They do not divide their political world in axes of evil, forces of the good / light, opposing forces of darkness and evil on the other side. They also refuse practicing the posture of prophets. They champion instead sobriety in political thinking and action, and endorse an ethics of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends, an ethics of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends. In other words, they take into account the consequences of their action for the entire communities, not only for the political groups to which they belong. Okay? And that involves often significant political and personal risks that they are willing to undertake. So if we are to look for a single word to characterize many, though not all, of the moderates that I refer to in my lecture tonight, I would like to describe them as trimmers, concerned with preserving the balance of the state. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the metaphor of the trimmer. It comes from a beautiful 17th century text, which is the 8th quote on my handout here. It comes from a 17th century English writer, Marquis of Halifax. It's a nautical metaphor from sailing. I do not sail. I don't pretend any knowledge of sailing. But trimming is a way of keeping the balance of the ship so that it prevents it from capsizing. So it depends on the direction of the winds and the strength of the winds, so you trim the sail of the ship to keep it from capsizing. Anyone here who has any sailing knowledge? Okay, trimming. Does it ring a bell? Yeah. Okay, so it's not easy to do it. Why? Because first of all, you need to be attentive to the direction of the wind, right? You have a lot of responsibilities. If you pull in the other direction, you may actually end up capsizing the ship. So and there's no algorithm for it. This is another way of saying it's not an easy art. It's an art that requires skill. I don't know how to sail. Okay, you wouldn't trust me with that task. It takes intuition. It takes attention to the moment. And of course, it takes some luck. It requires a great deal of courage as well. And this is what I want to suggest to you tonight, that being a moderate requires not only to have some vision about what is the good society that you are fighting for, but you also need boldness, audacity, and firmness, as well as a certain degree of non-conformity. So to restore equilibrium, balance, which is the supreme virtue that I emphasizing here, in society, you need to understand the society is made of plural interests and groups. Okay? Moderates tend to adopt some of the soundest attitudes and principles of all parties, okay? Again, at personal and political risk, and facilitate agreements between them. They work to calm passions in times when passions run high, and heal wounds, because we all have wounds in our bodies and our political bodies as well. So they seek to protect, in other words, the balance, always fragile, always threatened, between different political forces in a society. And this is the balance on which freedom depends in modern society. This balance, I want to emphasize, was at the heart of what Montesquieu, who was a major inspiration for the Founding Fathers, called moderate government. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, which is a book he published in 1748, distinguished between two types of governments, moderate and immoderate governments. Okay? Moderate governments are intrinsically complex, and they are based, as I suggested earlier, on a balance of powers, healthy pluralism, and an effective combination of interests in society. Moderate governments do not emerge out of nature. They emerge out of reflection and choice, and skillful design, institutional design. Moderate governments may take different institutional forms, which explains why, in practice, political moderation can take many forms. It's sometimes related to finding a center between the extremes, or a neutral power above the fray, okay? And in some cases, for example, in West European context, this is the regime called constitutional monarchies. I don't know whether you are aware, but Western Europe has, do you know how many monarchies are in Western Europe? Constitutional monarchies. Any guess? Any number? There are quite a few, I want to tell you. There are 10, yeah, 10. Okay, 10. 10. I've done this with my students, so I know the number by heart. Great guess there. 10 West European countries, from the most famous one, the English monarchy, to the smallest one, which may be like the Duchy of Luxembourg or whatever, or Monaco, are constitutional monarchies. So that's an interesting form of government in which the monarch rules but doesn't reign. No, reigns but doesn't rule. Okay, that's the idea, that the monarch is above the fray. It's like a constitutional referee above the political game. So if the political game goes south, then the monarch can pull the strings back, trims the sails of the ship of the state. But otherwise, you never hear the new king of Denmark, for example, ruling. Okay, it's the prime minister that rules. So that's one form of government, which is interesting. But there are others. It can be argued that the Supreme Court is a form of neutral power above the fray, though today it's very politicized, so it's difficult to make that argument. But that might be an argument that you need a form of, let's say, Conseil constitutionnel in the French case, constitutional council, something that would be above the fray, so that it could monitor the political game and the political temperature. So I would not equate moderation with the center, though moderates do tend to coalesce in the center. So it's important, I think, for the present purposes, to acknowledge that moderates can exist on all sides of the political spectrum, left, center, and right. So, in other words, moderation is not, contrary to what its critics say, a essentially conservative virtue. Okay? Moderates, however, do know that conservative ideas, principles, and values are necessary in various contexts, but sometimes conservative ideas themselves need to be radicalized and actualized. So moderates do not fear change or new ideas, and they sometimes do not profess a particular fondness for authority, which is a hallmark of conservatism. What I want to suggest is that moderation is instead an eclectic virtue. Eclecticism, meaning many colors, many flavors. And this explains why moderates, as historians of political thought know, have worn different masks, different faces over centuries. So you won't find someone who calls himself necessarily moderate, but you would find, for example, the Stoics. The Stoic philosophers have had a tradition of moderation built into their doctrines. If you look at the tradition of prudence, which is a virtue associated with moderation, which can be found in the writings of thinkers as diverse as Aristotle, Cicero, Machiavelli, and Burke, you'll see that there is a tradition of moderation built into that. There is also the tradition of skepticism that brings together thinkers as diverse as Hume, Kant, and Montaigne. And there is a tradition of a criticism of zealotry and fanaticism, where you can also find a face of moderation. What I want to suggest is that there's no single thinker that would say, I'm a moderate, therefore I'm the incarnation of that tradition. You need to look at different traditions to find these faces of moderation. I also have some concrete examples of moderate agendas. Some of you might be interested, just for the sake of the conversation. I don't know whether anyone is familiar here with a tradition in economic thought called ordoliberalism. Anyone knows about the social market economy in Germany? What Germany, did after World War II was, of course, to take the American money in 1947, which was a great gift, but they rebuilt their economy according to the principles of ordoliberalism, which is at the heart of the social market economy. The social market economy emerged from the ashes of the World War II, and it was a combination of classical liberalism with some Catholic social teachings. And that's the tradition of ordoliberalism that rebuilt basically Germany from scratch. There are other agendas, but this is one that I'm particularly fond of. Now, I think that it's important to ask what are the benefits of moderation. Now, you could say, okay, there are different faces, different agendas, but why should we care about that? Well, there are some benefits that I want to talk about. One is it's not an ideology with fixed contours. That's why I said you can find it on the left, center, or right. Not being an ideology with fixed contours, borders, it means that it can accommodate a wide range of political ideas and actors, okay? You don't need to be on one particular side to be a moderate. So there's a certain flexibility built into that. The second advantage is that it allows us, and this is the most important one, to think politically as opposed to thinking ideologically. Most of us have the tendency to think ideologically, okay? Which means that you feel you lean to the left or the right, and then you'll see the world through the lenses of that algorithm, of that, it's like blinds your view, so to speak. You have to be consistent. If you're on the left, you'll be pro-choice, you'll be for social welfare and open borders. If you're on the right, you'll be pro-life, against immigration, and you name it, against social welfare thing. You don't have to be like this. You can combine, if you are a moderate, you can combine principles from different traditions that are appropriate to the particular context in which you live. That means thinking politically. It's a question of being able to make the sensible, responsible decision in changing circumstances. Again, as I said, if you lived in the 1950s, you could have had a certain set of political views, but if you live in the 2020s, it's a different ballpark, different world. So moderation can be an effective means, if you understand it this way, for promoting changes that challenge the status quo, the hierarchy, and promote justice, social justice. So it's also a way of refusing to see the world according to one single principle. There's no one single best way to see the world. That's why moderates who think politically tend to promote piecemeal reforms. You don't want to reform everything in one full attempt, okay? You go piecemeal, step by step. In other words, moderates do not believe in miraculous panacea. There's no panacea. There's no miraculous drug that would heal all of our problems, okay? There are no absolute blueprints, no final synthesis. All you can do, if you are thinking responsibly about political choices, is to maintain the balance between, always fragile, between different principles in society, okay? And that's why moderates are committed to defending pluralism, of ideas, principles, and interests, and of course nurturing freedom, because freedom comes from this pluralism. And this is the third benefit of moderation that I want to emphasize here. If you believe in what I've said thus far, then moderates allow us to be flexible and to oppose fanaticism and dogmatism, which is, I think, the two major vices that we see in politics today, fanaticism and dogmatism. Moderates are also able to correct mistakes and detect mistakes, mid-course corrections, and promote trade-offs between different values and principles. They are never sure that their proposed reforms will be the most effective ones, but they are willing to keep an open mind to make mid-course corrections. And if you want to look at the example of a moderate way of thinking, take a look, I don't have time to read it, at what Benjamin Franklin said upon the signing of the Constitution in Philadelphia. He wasn't sure that was the best way, but he was willing to give it a shot and try to improve it later. Okay? There is a fourth advantage of moderation, and that is it promotes civility and compromise. Without these two values, civility and compromise, there is no democratic system that is functioning. Okay? All you have is a shouting match, okay? My way or the highway. And moderation helps promote what is called, properly speaking, civil politics, okay? And in so doing, it allows us to avoid becoming self-righteous and teaches us humility and self-restraint. Think about how many politicians we've seen being self-righteous, I know better than you, and how little humility and self-restraint they display. Moderation is like an art of conversation, okay? It allows us to participate in the conversation, but it also requires a talent for listening, irony and courtesy, okay, and a sense of humor. You need to be detached. You are not the center of the universe. And finally, there are two more advantages that I want to highlight before I conclude. Moderation and moderates in particular display a strong commitment to dialogue. And they are opposed to monologue, which is by definition the characteristics of echo chambers. In echo chambers, we may talk to others, but it's a monologue. It's not a dialogue. You don't listen to others. You don't understand what others are saying. You don't want to listen to others. The belief of the moderates is that may the other side also be heard. This is the fundamental principle of justice, okay? That's at the core of our justice system. May the other side be heard. Moderates demand that dissenting voices be heard and taken seriously into account, and they claim the right to hesitate when weighing between the pros and cons of each side, okay? And they look at the world as a vast school of inquiry from which they stand to learn. And the final advantage of moderation, as I suggested earlier, is that it can accommodate different cultural and religious traditions, okay? And a fundamental idea, I think, can be found at the heart of all of this tradition, which is that a middle course in life is the safest way. It's a balance between too much and too little, and the assumption that the joys of life can be enjoyed most if we are moderate and temperate in trying them. Okay? The Swedish, there's a chapter in my book about humility. The Swedish have a word about that. It's called lagom. So if you are curious, you may read more about that. It's the chapter on modesty and humility. Lagom is like it's that virtue that allows you to share with others. You are at a party and you pass on a drink or something, and everyone partakes a little bit of that, but everyone has enough to share with others. It's something that you know the old Vikings used to do in Sweden. It's called lagom. So I think it's time to return to my initial question: who needs moderation today? And you may still believe no one, and that's okay with me. What I would like to do is to rephrase the question: what kind of moderation we might need in our hyper-polarized world? And I think that the conclusion that I would like to share with you, and this is the conclusion of my book as well, is that What we need today is a muscular and radical form of moderation, which is not a contradiction in terms. It's not a fuzzy center. It's not the fuzzy center that looks for safe spaces. It's a radical form of moderation that consists and requires that we affirm our opinions boldly, with civility and clarity. We don't use language that would try to hide what we think and deceive others, okay? We need a form of moderation that is accompanied by a sense of proportions and firmness of character, okay? This form of moderation that I praise in this book refrains from attacking persons, okay? Refrains from issuing cancellations, proscriptions, or enforcing litmus tests, purity tests. You are a rhino, you are a dino, Republican in name only, Democrat in name only. You don't do that. You don't see the world in Manichaean terms. It challenges received dogmas, and it does not close its eyes to forms of injustice and inequality, and defends fundamental principles of democratic life, such as the rule of law. So there are a number of rules that I want to conclude with. I just want to invite to a conversation here, and there are 5 of them. Actually, I think in the book I have 10, but for the sake of the conversation, I reduce them to 5. That's a form of moderation. Rule number 1, refuse to define one single best way, okay? There's no such thing. Do not have fixed truth or dogmas when it comes to the political realm. Instead, examine facts. Be prepared to change your views as facts may change. Okay? That's number 1. Rule number 2, avoid echo chambers and avoid bubbles, and do not be sectarian in defending your views. Always try to think politically rather than ideologically. Keep the open lines of dialogue with your opponents, even when the dialogue may be uncomfortable, and I know that it is, because it's always better to talk to friends and like-minded people than to opponents. That's number 2. No echo chambers, no bubbles. Rule number 3, do not be a perfectionist. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Don't start with the theory of justice, necessarily. Try to improve from bottom up. Defend piecemeal reforms, step by step, rather than utopian blueprints for change. Remember that the world is made of many shades of gray, not 50 shades of gray, but still 5. Rule number 4, do not be obsessed with purity, with litmus tests. Resist the temptation to divide your world in the axis of evil and the axis of good. Okay? You may never know which side you'll end up being, number 1, so that's prudent. But you really can't figure out who is on one side and who is on the other, except at the end of history. Rule number 5, no particular belief should hurt you in political life. Admit, and this is the most difficult thing, admit that most political issues have more than one answer, more than one side. As a result, I think resist to interpret the world in light of one single principle, and this is the conclusion of my talk. Resist to look at political realm in light of one value, such as pro-life or pro-choice, New Green Deal or no deal, okay? Lower taxes or higher taxes, for Second Amendment or against Second Amendment. Try to see the complexity behind this. Don't simplify. Preach complexity. Be prepared to change your views if new facts come to your attention. So I should like to end by quoting the words of Tocqueville. This is the last quote on my handout. And this is the quote that I use as the epigraph for my book. It's a little bit presumptuous of me to use these words as the epigraph of my book, but this gives you a sense of the spirit in which I tried to write this book, intended for a general public, not an academic one. Towards the end of the introduction to democracy in America, the Frenchman confessed, and I will read this because it's a beautiful quote that illustrates the spirit in which I see my contribution to this public debate. This book follows in no one's train exactly. By writing it, I did not mean either to serve or to combat any party. I set about to see not differently, but further than the parties. And while they are concerned with the next day, I wanted to think about the future. To him, as well as to me, if I may add my name to that, moderation was not a source of weakness, but a source of strength. It was the guiding principle of good government and decent society. And this is exactly what I believe we should all strive for. We can't get to the just society as yet, but we can try to build a decent society. This was true in 1840 when Tocqueville wrote these beautiful words. So the question for me that I would like to leave you to answer on your own is, does his message still hold true today? I think you can easily guess my answer to this question, but it would be more prudent of me to invite all of you tonight to answer this question on your own. So thank you.
And I want to thank you on behalf of McConnell Center for coming to speak to us about the importance of moderation today. This is our gift to extend to you.
I hope a moderate one.
Yes, yes. And then also, if you could sign this for our McConnell Center Library as well.
I will. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the book, or you'll enjoy the book. I don't know. You don't have to read the whole thing. It's an invitation to a conversation. It's a little bit awkward for me to write to young radicals, and I imagine two of them. Some of you may sympathize with Lauren, who is from the left. Some may sympathize with Rob from the right. I kind of made them up. I mean, honestly, they are imaginary interlocutors. But I thought that one of the things that it seems to me is essential to moderation is dialogue and the ability to kind of answer objections to your views. And this is something that we academics are not good at. We tend to be self-righteous and imagine that we have the answers to this question. So in a way, this book, as written again for a general public, is a platonic dialogue with the many voices in myself. I'm not sure where the truth lies. I'm sometimes inclined to side with Lauren, sometimes with Rob, and that's why with Greg I thought we should assign the last part of the book in which there's a conversation about the future of democracy in America. Does democracy have a liberal democracy has a future in America? And I'm curious to see what you think about that. The book has lots of dialogues that are interspersed in the course of the conversation. I thought that the voices of my younger interlocutors are as important as my voice. And what I did, I looked into some magazines that I listed at the beginning. So I put in their mouth real words uttered by journalists on the left and the right. Occasionally I made them up, but most of what they say there rely on what journalists from both sides have to say about the future of democracy in America. So the question is, who is moderation today? Maybe nobody. And I do not have a final answer to this, but I'm curious to see what you think.
Why don't we take 5 and then come back with that?
Absolutely. Thank you.